Reconstruction and the Definition of Freedom. Lecture Key Terms. In this lecture, we will work through a number of themes that focus on the creation, implementation, and removal of the period of post-Civil War Reconstruction in the United States from 1865 to 1877. Each lecture that I post for this course will have a set of lecture key terms at the beginning of each lecture. These terms will be used primarily for the identification section on each of your exams. Differing visions of freedom in the post-war South. Focus question: what visions of freedom did the former slaves and slaveholders pursue in the post-war South? The meaning of freedom for the former slaves. Families and freedom. The destruction of slavery made freedom the central question on the nation's agenda as soon as the war was over. African Americans' understanding of freedom was ultimately shaped by their experience as slaves, as well as their observation of the free society around them. The family was central to the post-emancipation black community. Freedom subtly altered the relationships within the black family. The family ultimately led former slaves to seek out and find loved ones separated from them by sale during slavery, and widows of black soldiers won the fight to gain pensions from the federal government for their late husbands. This acknowledged the status of slave marriages as legal in the United States. Reconstruction also transformed the relationships within families, as black men and women sought to inhabit the, quote, separate spheres, end quote, of free families. Women would be spending more time with families at home, and men engaged in most of the work outside the home. Black women withdrew from work as field laborers and house servants to this domestic sphere as long as they could afford to. Eventually, the suffering economy in the South made many black women go back to work because of the poverty situation. Church and school was also extremely important in the black community. The rise of independent black churches, especially the Methodist and Baptist churches, commanded the largest followings. The rise of these churches caused a redrawing of the religious map of the South. This was significant because the black community were not allowed to have an organized religious life under slavery. Blacks of all ages also flocked to the schools that were established by Northern missionary societies like the Freedmans Bureau, and groups of ex-slaves also came to be educated. Again, this was sought after by many because they were not allowed to have formal education under slavery. Black colleges such as Fisk College, Hampton College, and Howard College were all started during this Reconstruction period as a result. The independent black churches will also bring about the rise of black ministers coming to play roles in politics as the black community gains the right to vote. Ideas of freedom. Political freedom would be extremely important to the black community after the Civil War was over. The right to vote inevitably became central to the former slaves' desire for empowerment and equality. Being denied suffrage meant the stigma of inferiority. To demonstrate their patriotism, blacks throughout the South organized 4th of July celebrations, and for many years, white Southerners in protest would remain indoors on this holiday. Land, labor, and freedom were all interconnected to the freed slaves. the former slaves' ideas of freedom were directly related to land ownership. Many former slaves insisted that through their unpaid labor, they had acquired a right to the land. The ex-slaves' definition of freedom resembled their white counterparts. They believed in self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, and economic autonomy. Masters without slaves, however, would make coexisting a problem. The South's defeat was complete and demoralizing. Planter families faced profound changes as a result. Most planters defined black freedom in the narrowest manner, as a privilege, not as a right, something that they gave to their former slaves, not something that those black communities had as a right. Whites felt the slave was, quote, free, but free only to labor. The free labor vision was connected with the Freedmen's Bureau. The victorious Republican North tried to implement its own vision of freedom. Free labor would result in the ex-slaves being more productive, they saw. And this is one of the processes that led to the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was to establish a working free labor system for the black community. The Freedmen's Bureau. The task of the Bureau was to establish schools, provide aid to the poor and aged, and they also were to settle disputes amongst these groups. This was a daunting task, especially because it had fewer than 1,000 agents at any given time. The direction of the Freedmen's Bureau was under O.O. Howard, and he had his work cut out for him with this Herculean task. The most significant achievements that the Bureau made came in education and health care. Nearly 3,000 schools reported to the Bureau. The failure of land reform, however, made it difficult for many former slaves. Blacks wanted land of their own, not just jobs on the plantations of their former masters. President Andrew Johnson negated most of the promises made to the former slaves with the Sherman land. The 40 acres and a mule was taken away from them. All of those lands that had been confiscated from former slaveholders would be returned to its former owners under President Johnson. Because no land distribution took place, the vast majority of rural freed people remained poor and without property during Reconstruction. Many of them would ultimately have to resign themselves to work on the white-owned plantations, often for their former owners, but now they were wage earners. Sharecropping came to dominate the cotton growing in the South, as well as much of the tobacco belt. Sharecropping initially arose as a compromise between blacks' desire for land and planters' desire for labor discipline. For blacks, sharecropping, even for their former masters, was preferable to gang labor. But over time, sharecropping became oppressive. The white farmer. The aftermath of the war hurt small white farmers, especially those who never owned slaves. The crop lien system came about. Ultimately, the crop lien system was the use of one's crop as collateral for loans from merchants for supplies so they could continue to work the land. white farmers increased cotton cultivation under the crop lien system. But eventually, the overproduction of cotton led to cotton prices plummeting. And these white farmers found themselves unable to pay back the loans. Ultimately, many of those crops, many of those lands were foreclosed upon as a result. Both black and white farmers found themselves caught in the sharecropping and crop lien systems. Southern cities experienced a remarkable growth after the Civil War, however, as a result of this, as prices for cotton plummeted. Many poor folks flocked to the cities in order to find work. This will lead to the rise of a new middle class in the South, as the South becomes increasingly industrialized to mirror the North. The aftermaths of slavery. The Reconstruction era debates over transitioning from slavery to freedom had parallels in other Western Hemisphere countries as well, where emancipation had occurred earlier in the 19th century. Former slaves sought to assert independence in their daily lives in the United States. Planters sought other laborers to replace their slave forces. British Caribbean planters brought workers from India and China to work their lands. The southern United States planters oftentimes recruited some of those workers from China as well. Only in the United States did former slaves gain political rights quickly in a relative way. The right to vote would eventually come within a generation after the end of the Civil War. The making of radical Reconstruction. Focus question. What were the competing visions of Reconstruction? Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's successor to the presidency. He was initially responsible for Reconstruction after the war. Johnson had rose from poverty to a political career in state politics in the state of Tennessee, which he represented in the U.S. Congress and where he was also governor. Johnson championed Tennessee's small white farmers and made enemies of the state's large slave-owning planters prior to the war. Staunchly a Unionist, he was the only senator from a seceding state to remain in the Senate, and he served as Tennessee's military governor during the war. His vice presidency, Republicans hoped, would gain support for the party in the South. But Johnson lacked Lincoln's political acumen and ability to compromise. Johnson also defended states' rights. He argued that since secession was illegal, Southern states never actually left the Union or gave up their right to govern their own affairs. And Johnson, while supporting emancipation, was deeply racist and did not believe blacks had a role to play in Reconstruction at all. In May of 1865, Johnson started to release proclamations that inaugurated a period that historians call Presidential Reconstruction. Johnson offered pardons, which restored political and property rights, except for slaves, to all white Southerners who took an oath of allegiance, excluding only Confederate leaders and wealthy planters whose pre-war property was worth more than $20,000. But Johnson soon pardoned those exempted by this rule as well. He also appointed provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions, elected by whites only, to establish loyal Southern state governments. These new state governments were required only to abolish slavery, repudiate secession, and refuse to pay Confederate whites' debts. While many people in the North at first supported Johnson's plan, Southern whites mostly returned prominent Confederates and old elites to power, and violence against freed people and Northerners in the South generated opposition to Johnson's policies. The failure of presidential Reconstruction came about largely because Johnson's plan for Reconstruction offered pardons, as I said, to the white Southern elite. And Johnson's plan also allowed for the new state governments a free hand in managing local affairs. The conduct of the white Southerners turned the Republican North against the plan. And eventually, the Senate will come up with a different plan. Another issue that came about due to presidential Reconstruction was the creation of the black codes in the South. Southern governments began passing new laws that restricted the freedom of the black community. The black community couldn't testify against whites, they couldn't serve on juries or in state militias, or vote. These new laws also violated free labor principles and called for a vigorous response from the Republican North. With the states' rights guaranteed to them, these Southern governments were working around the system in order to restrict the freedom that the blacks had obtained. Few groups of rebels in history have been treated more leniently than the defeated Confederates. The North was not motivated by a desire to punish them, but to ensure emancipation of the slaves. The radical Republicans in the North will eventually be the ones that call for the dissolution of Johnson's state governments in favor of establishing new ones that did not have, quote, rebels in power, and which gave blacks the right to vote. These radical Republicans saw a golden opportunity to create equal rights for all. Some of the most prominent of these radical Republicans were Charles Sumner and the famous Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens' most cherished aim was to confiscate the land of disloyal planters, those who were known to have supported the Confederacy, and divide it among their former slaves and northern migrants that were coming to the South to reestablish themselves in a new life. Although Thaddeus Stevens' ideas were extremely revolutionary, most Republicans were moderates, not radicals, and they had trouble supporting a good many of his ideas. However, we do see the origins of civil rights being born at this time with the rise of what will be known as Congressional Reconstruction. Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois proposed 2 bills to modify Johnson's Reconstruction policy. First of all, he wanted to extend the life of the Freedmans Bureau. Second of all, he wanted to pass a civil rights bill that guaranteed equality before the law as central. It also sought to overturn the black codes that had been established in the South. These 2 bills were both vetoed by Johnson as president. He believed that they would centralize power in the national government and deprive the states of the authority to regulate themselves. Even though Johnson vetoed these bills, Congress had the votes to pass the Civil Rights Bill anyway, over the veto of the president. They also later extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau against the presidential veto. This will eventually lead to the creation of what will be the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which will eventually be passed in 1868. The 14th Amendment placed in the Constitution the principle of citizenship for all persons born in the United States and empowered the federal government to protect the rights of all Americans. It did not, however, provide for black suffrage. The 14th Amendment made the most important change to the Constitution since the Bill of Rights, many could argue. It will change the face of this nation forever. Another idea that was passed by the Congress during Reconstruction was the Reconstruction Act. Johnson campaigned against the 14th Amendment in his bid for the presidency later in 1868, and he also supported those who supported his ideas in the 1866 midterm elections. All southern states except for Tennessee refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. In March of 1867, over Johnson's veto, Congress adopted the Reconstruction Act. This divided the South into 5 military districts and called for the creation of new southern state governments, with black men being given the right to vote. The Reconstruction Act, thus, began radical Reconstruction, which will last until 1877. Radical Reconstruction is sometimes also referred to as Congressional Reconstruction. Along with the Reconstruction Act, Congress simultaneously approved a measure prohibiting the President from removing certain office holders, including members of his own cabinet, without the Senate's consent. This was called the Tenure Act. Johnson believed that this unconstitutionally limited his authority, and to demonstrate his dislike for the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson removed the Secretary of War from office in 1868. Johnson was impeached by the Senate, but the Senate fell 1 vote short from removing him from office. Johnson would remain in office, but ultimately the tide would turn against him by the election later that November. Some Republicans voted to keep Johnson based on his promise to not interfere anymore with Republican policies. But yet, he will not be the nominee. And eventually, the war hero U.S. Grant wins the election of 1868. With the election of Grant, we have the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. It would be ratified in 1870. The 15th Amendment provided for black suffrage, but unfortunately there were still many loopholes that allowed state-sanctioned discrimination, so many would still be disenfranchised. Loopholes existed. States could discriminate who they allowed to vote with literacy tests, with poll taxes, and with property qualifications. All of these things made the 15th Amendment not quite incorporate all and give all of the black men the vote. However, this is still considered a great constitutional revolution. The laws and amendments of Reconstruction reflected the intersection of 2 products of the Civil War era: a newly empowered national state and the idea of a national citizenry enjoying equality before the law. Before the Civil War, American citizenship had been closely linked to race. The new amendments also transformed the relationship between the federal government and the states. The federal government had become the custodian of freedom. But there were still no votes for women. Freedom was still only given to men. So what about the rights of women? The 14th and 15th Amendments produced splits. Many women's leaders, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who had originally supported many of the ideas of the radical Republicans, found themselves not supported by those radical Republicans. Stanton and Anthony eventually will also find themselves divorced from other women's leaders who did not believe in as radical ideas as they had. As it turns out, the Supreme Court had stated that the principles of free labor do not apply to women. Even so, despite the limitations, the 14th and 15th Amendments and the Reconstruction Act of 1867 marked a radical departure in American and world history. And eventually, women will lobby and get the right to vote. However, it will not happen until after World War I.